The transport ship's emergency lights bathed everything in red as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen checked his rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. Around him, the other members of the Joint Peacekeeping Force sat in silence, their alien faces unreadable behind their helmets. The Velkari soldiers looked like walking trees with their bark-like skin and towering frames. The Zephyrians resembled giant mantises, their compound eyes reflecting the red light like tiny mirrors. And then there was Marcus, the only human on a ship full of beings who could tear him apart without breaking a sweat. The mission briefing had been simple enough. A research station on the frontier planet Kepler 442b had gone dark 3 days ago. The Joint Peacekeeping Force was being sent to investigate and provide assistance if needed. What they found when they dropped out of hyperspace was something none of them had expected. The research station wasn't just dark. It was surrounded by ships, dozens of them, sleek and angular, belonging to the hegemony of swords, a militant faction that had been causing trouble in this sector for months. The station itself showed signs of heavy damage, its outer hull scarred by weapon fire. Commander Thexvar, a Velkari whose bark-like skin bore the deep grooves of age and experience, turned to address the squad. The situation is more complex than intelligence suggested. The hegemony has taken the station and is holding the research staff hostage. Our mission parameters have changed. Marcus adjusted his helmet's display, running through the tactical information flowing across his visor. The hegemony of swords wasn't just another pirate group. They were organized, well-armed, and had a reputation for leaving no witnesses. The research station housed nearly 200 civilian scientists from various species, all working on classified terraforming technology. The plan is straightforward, Thexvar continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen countless battles. We'll approach using stealth pods. The Zephyrians will handle electronic warfare and communications jamming. The Velkari will provide heavy assault capabilities. The human will. The commander paused, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the entire squad on him. He was used to this reaction. Humans were new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Most species saw them as weak, soft creatures who had somehow stumbled into space travel through luck rather than skill. The human will provide reconnaissance and support. Thexvar finished. Marcus nodded. He had expected as much. In every joint operation he had participated in, humans were always given the safest, least important jobs. It wasn't malicious. Exactly. The other species genuinely believed they were protecting him. Humans were smaller, weaker, and slower than most galactic species. What the aliens didn't understand was that sometimes those perceived weaknesses could become strengths. The stealth pods launched an hour later, small one-person craft designed to slip past enemy sensors. Marcus piloted his pod with practiced ease, using the micro-thrusters to adjust his trajectory as they approached the station. Through his visor display, he could see the positions of his squad mates, each pod following a carefully planned approach vector. The plan fell apart in the first 5 minutes. The hegemony had been expecting them. As soon as the pods came within range of the station, concealed weapon platforms opened fire. Marcus watched in horror as Zephyrian Lieutenant Clixtek's pod took a direct hit, exploding in a brief flash of light and debris. 2 more pods were hit in quick succession, their occupants lost to the void. Abort mission. Abort mission. Thexvar's voice crackled over the communication system. All units returned to the transport immediately, but Marcus could see something the others couldn't. His pod's position, originally chosen because it was the safest approach vector, had taken him around the back side of the station, while the other pods were being torn apart by the concealed weapons. Marcus had a clear view of the station's service bay. The massive door was partially open, just wide enough for a single pod to slip through. Commander, this is Chen. I have a clear approach to Service Bay 7. Requesting permission to continue mission. The silence on the communication channel stretched for several seconds. Marcus could imagine what was going through the commander's mind. A lone human, attempting what an entire squad had just failed to accomplish. Negative, Chen. Return to the transport immediately. That's an order. Marcus looked at his fuel gauge. He had enough power to make it back to the transport, but barely. If he attempted to infiltrate the station, there would be no going back. He would be on his own, with no backup and no extraction plan. Through the service bay opening, Marcus could see movement. Guards patrolling the corridors beyond. The hegemony soldiers were tall and lean, with 4 arms each, and faces like angry wolves. Their weapons were military grade, far superior to anything the research station would have had for defense. Marcus thought about the 200 civilians trapped inside. Scientists, researchers, people who had never signed up for this kind of violence. They were depending on the peacekeeping force to save them, but the peacekeeping force was in retreat, leaving them to whatever fate the hegemony had planned. "Copy that, Commander," Marcus said into his radio. Then he switched it off. He fired his pod's thrusters and slipped through the service bay, opening like a ghost. The pod touched down with barely a whisper, its stealth coating absorbing the impact sensor's probes. Marcus popped the hatch and rolled out, his rifle already in his hands. The service bay was dimly lit, filled with maintenance equipment and storage containers, perfect cover for someone who knew how to use it. Marcus had grown up in the slums of New Angeles, where staying alive meant learning how to move without being seen and fight with whatever you could find. The Marine Corps had refined those skills, teaching him that sometimes the best weapon wasn't the biggest gun, but the ability to think 3 steps ahead of your enemy. He moved through the service bay like a shadow, using the containers and machinery to mask his approach. The station's layout was standard for this type of facility, and Marcus had studied the blueprints during the flight. The civilian quarters would be in the central hub, probably under heavy guard. But there were maintenance tunnels, service corridors, and emergency routes that most people forgot about. The first hegemony soldier Marcus encountered was standing guard at a junction between the service area and the main corridors. The alien was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with muscles that rippled under his dark uniform. His rifle was nearly as long as Marcus was tall. Marcus waited in the shadows, studying the guard's patrol pattern. The hegemony soldier was disciplined, checking his corners and staying alert, but he was also overconfident, secure in the knowledge that his forces controlled the station. When the guard turned to check the opposite corridor, Marcus struck. He had learned from his alien squad mates that sometimes the direct approach wasn't the best one. Instead of trying to overpower a creature twice his size, Marcus used precision. A small-shaped charge, placed exactly where the station's artificial gravity generator connected to the deck plating. The explosion was tiny, barely audible, but it was enough to disrupt the gravity field in a 10-foot radius. The guard found himself suddenly weightless, his massive frame becoming a liability as he flailed helplessly in midair. Marcus propelled himself forward, using the guard's own momentum to drive his combat knife between the plates of the alien's armor. The hegemony soldier went limp, neutralized without ever having a chance to sound an alarm. 1 down, approximately 40 to go. Marcus continued deeper into the station, using the maintenance tunnels to bypass the main corridors where the hegemony had concentrated their forces. The tunnels were cramped and dark, barely wide enough for his human frame. Any of the larger alien species would have found them impossible to navigate. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices. The hegemony soldiers were speaking in their own language, but Marcus's universal translator picked up fragments of their conversation. They were talking about a deadline. Something was going to happen in 6 hours. Marcus found an access panel and carefully pried it open. Through the gap, he could see into what had been the station's main laboratory. The room was filled with equipment he didn't recognize, but the intent was clear. The hegemony wasn't just holding hostages. They were stealing the research data, downloading everything the station had learned about terraforming technology. 3 hegemony soldiers stood guard in the lab while a 4th worked at a computer terminal. Their attention was focused on the download progress, a glowing bar that was slowly filling as terabytes of classified information flowed into their systems. Marcus studied the room's layout. 4 targets, multiple potential cover positions, and dozens of delicate instruments that could provide concealment. The smart play would be to retreat, find another way around, avoid confrontation until he could locate the hostages. But Marcus had never been one to take the smart play when people's lives were on the line. He pulled a small mirror from his kit and used it to check the blind spots in the room. The hegemony soldiers were positioned to watch the main entrances, but they hadn't considered that someone might come through the ventilation system. Marcus carefully removed the access panel's screws, setting each one aside with practiced silence. The first indication the guards had that something was wrong was when the lights went out. Marcus had cut the power to the lab's primary lighting system, plunging the room into darkness. But he had the advantage. His helmet's night vision system painted the room in green and black, showing him exactly where each target was positioned. The hegemony soldiers reacted with trained precision, moving to cover positions and activating their own low-light equipment. But in those crucial first seconds of confusion, Marcus was already moving. He dropped from the ceiling access point directly behind the soldier working at the computer terminal. A sleeper hold, applied with just enough pressure to cut off blood flow to the brain without causing permanent damage. The alien slumped forward, unconscious but alive. The other 3 guards realized they were under attack when their companion failed to respond to their calls. They began to converge on his position, weapons raised, scanning for threats. Marcus was already gone. He had rolled under a bank of laboratory equipment, using the complex machinery to mask his thermal signature. The hegemony soldiers were trained for conventional warfare, not for fighting an opponent who could disappear into shadows and strike from unexpected angles. The second soldier went down when Marcus triggered another gravity disruption. This one centered on a support beam directly above the alien's position. Without gravity to anchor him, the soldier found himself pushed upward by his own momentum, his head making hard contact with the ceiling. 2 down. The remaining guards had figured out they were dealing with someone using unconventional tactics. They began to work together, one watching high, while the other covered low, moving in coordinated sweeps that would make it difficult for Marcus to get close. But they were still thinking like conventional soldiers, expecting their enemy to behave like the opponents they had faced before. They were looking for another soldier, someone who would use military tactics and engage them on equal terms. Marcus wasn't another soldier. He was a human. Instead of attacking the guards directly, Marcus began to manipulate the environment around them. A careful adjustment to the lab's atmospheric controls caused a thin layer of vapor to begin forming on the floor. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to muffle sounds and create visual distortion. Next, he activated several pieces of laboratory equipment, their humming and beeping creating an acoustic maze that made it difficult to track movement by sound. The guards found themselves surrounded by potential threats, unable to distinguish between the noise of machines and the footsteps of their attacker. When Marcus finally struck, it was from a direction neither guard had anticipated. He came through a wall panel that had been designed to provide access to the lab's primary data conduits. The opening was barely large enough for his human frame, impossible for either of the larger aliens to use. The third guard went down to a taser, 50,000 volts delivered directly to the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. The weapon was designed for human physiology, but Marcus had done his homework. The location he targeted was a common weak point across most humanoid species. The last guard spun toward the sound, but Marcus was already moving again. He had learned from watching his alien squadmates that sometimes the best way to defeat a superior opponent was to make them defeat themselves. A small explosive charge, placed precisely on the guard's own weapon, caused the rifle to malfunction spectacularly. The weapon's power cell overloaded, creating a brief but intense electromagnetic pulse that fried the guard's armor systems and left him blind, deaf, and helpless. 4 down, 36 to go. Marcus quickly examined the computer terminal the first guard had been using. The download was 60% complete, with classified terraforming data flowing into hegemony databases in real time. This wasn't just theft. The technology being stolen could be used to transform entire worlds, making them suitable for habitation or completely uninhabitable, depending on how it was applied. He couldn't stop the download without alerting the rest of the hegemony force. But he could do something else. Marcus pulled out a small data storage device and connected it to the terminal. If the hegemony wanted the research data, they were going to get a little something extra. The virus Marcus uploaded was a piece of human ingenuity, designed by military programmers who understood that sometimes the best way to fight a technologically superior enemy was to turn their own technology against them. The virus would remain dormant until the hegemony tried to use the stolen data, then activate and corrupt every system it touched. With the virus in place, Marcus turned his attention to finding the hostages. According to the station's blueprints, the civilian quarters were located in the central hub, 3 levels up from his current position. The most direct route would take him through the main corridors, past multiple guard posts and security checkpoints. The most direct route was also the most dangerous, but Marcus had learned something important during his infiltration of the laboratory. The hegemony soldiers were skilled and disciplined, but they were fighting the war they expected to fight, not the war Marcus was bringing to them. He made his way through the station like a ghost, using maintenance shafts, emergency passages, and service corridors that had been designed for routine upkeep, not military operations. Every time he encountered a guard or patrol, he found a way around them, leaving the aliens unaware that death had passed within arm's reach. The first hostages he found were in what had been the station's conference room. 12 researchers, mostly Velkari and Zephyrian, bound and guarded by 2 hegemony soldiers. Marcus studied the situation from a ventilation grate above the room. The hostages were terrified but unharmed. The guards were alert but bored, their attention focused on watching the prisoners rather than scanning for threats. It was a tactical mistake that Marcus could exploit, but first, he needed information. Using his helmet's external speakers, Marcus activated a small audio recording he had made during his time with the Joint Peacekeeping Force. Commander Thexvar's voice filled the room, speaking in the hegemony's own language. Attention hegemony forces. This is Commander Thexvar of the Galactic Peacekeeping Authority. Your position is surrounded. Release the hostages immediately and prepare to surrender. The recording was a bluff, but it served its purpose. The 2 guards immediately activated their communication systems, trying to contact their commander to report the development. In doing so, they revealed the location of their command post and provided Marcus with intelligence about their communication protocols. More importantly, they revealed something else. As they spoke rapidly into their radios, Marcus's translator picked up fragments of their conversation. The hegemony wasn't planning to hold the station indefinitely. They had an extraction timeline, and it was running short. 4 hours until they finished downloading the research data, 3 hours until their extraction ships arrived, 2 hours until they began executing hostages to ensure no witnesses remained. Marcus felt a familiar cold settle in his stomach. He had been in situations like this before, where time was the enemy and every minute wasted meant more innocent lives lost. The rational thing to do would be to retreat, try to contact the peacekeeping force, and request reinforcements. But reinforcements would take too long to arrive. The hostages didn't have time for rational solutions. They needed a miracle. And sometimes, Marcus reflected as he began to move through the ventilation system toward the central hub, miracles looked a lot like an angry human marine with nothing left to lose. The Badlands tested every member of Morrison's outfit in ways they had never anticipated. Waterholes that should have been reliable turned out to be dried mud cracks. The cattle grew restless and difficult to manage in the heat that seemed to radiate from the very rocks around them. Eleanor learned to stretch every drop of water, creating meals from ingredients that would have seemed impossible to transform into food just weeks earlier. It was during this harsh stretch that she began to understand Nash better. Not through words, but through actions that spoke louder than any conversation. When her water barrel developed a slow leak, Nash appeared before dawn with tools and materials to repair it, working in silence while she prepared breakfast. When a group of the younger cowboys began making comments about her appearance after weeks on the trail, Nash's presence nearby seemed to discourage their crude observations without him saying a single word. Eleanor had grown up believing that protection came through proper channels, through fathers and brothers and eventual husbands who would shield ladies from the harsh realities of the world. But Nash's brand of protection was different. It was quiet, consistent, and asked for nothing in return. He never made her feel helpless or incapable, but somehow she always felt safer when he was near. The revelation came on a Tuesday that started like any other difficult day in the Badlands. Eleanor was preparing the noon meal when she heard Morrison calling for Nash with unusual urgency. She looked up to see a rider approaching in the distance, moving fast across the rocky terrain. The stranger who rode into their camp brought news that turned Eleanor's blood cold. The rustlers they had encountered earlier were not just random thieves but part of the notorious Kellerman gang led by a man named Blackjack Kellerman, who had been terrorizing the territory for months. Worse, they had learned about Morrison's valuable herd and were reportedly tracking them through the Badlands. How many men they got? Morrison asked the messenger. Near on 20, maybe more. Well armed and mean as rattlesnakes. They've been hitting drives all season, and they don't leave witnesses. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard stories of what men like Kellerman did to women they encountered on the frontier. The other cowboys looked grim, checking their weapons with the automatic movements of men preparing for violence. Nash listened to the report with an expression that had gone completely cold. When the messenger finished speaking, Nash stepped forward. "I know Kellerman," he said quietly. "Know how he thinks, how he operates." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "You been holding out on us, Nash?" "Not holding out. Just didn't see the need to dig up old business. But if Kellerman's tracking us, old business becomes current problems." Eleanor watched Nash's face transform as he spoke. The careful neutrality she had grown accustomed to was replaced by something harder, more dangerous. This was a side of him she had sensed but never seen, and it both frightened and fascinated her. "What aren't you telling us?" Morrison pressed. Nash was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. 5 years ago, Kellerman killed my partner during a bank robbery in Abilene. I tracked him for 6 months before the law told me to let it go. Seems he's moved on to bigger prey since then. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. So Nash had been a lawman, which explained his skills with weapons and his ability to anticipate trouble. But it also explained the shadows in his eyes and his reluctance to talk about his past. "Why didn't you catch him?" young Tommy Wells asked innocently. Nash's smile was colder than winter wind. "Who says I didn't?" The implications of that statement hung in the air like gun smoke. Morrison studied Nash with new understanding. "If you got history with Kellerman, that makes you valuable. But it also makes you a target. You sure you want to stay with us for this fight?" Nash looked directly at Eleanor for the first time that day. "I'm not going anywhere." That evening, as the men planned their defense strategy, Eleanor found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. The thought of violence coming to their small community on wheels filled her with dread, but something else troubled her more deeply. Nash's revelation had peeled back another layer of the mystery surrounding him, but it also made her realize how little she truly knew about the man who had become such a constant presence in her life. She was scrubbing pots when Nash approached the chuck wagon. Instead of his usual brief appearance, he lingered, seeming to struggle with something. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "Eleanor." Hearing her name from his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "There's something you should understand about what's coming. Kellerman isn't just another outlaw. He's smart, he's ruthless, and he doesn't follow the usual rules." Eleanor set down her scrub brush. "What are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you that if things go bad, you should know there are choices. Sometimes running is smarter than fighting. Are you suggesting I abandon these men?" "I'm suggesting you stay alive." Eleanor studied his face in the flickering firelight. "What about you? Are you planning to run?" Nash shook his head. "I can't run from Kellerman anymore. Tried that for 5 years, and it didn't work. Some things follow you, no matter how far you travel. Then I'm not running either." "Eleanor, this isn't your fight." Neither was learning to cook over an open fire, or sleep on the ground, or deal with stubborn cattle. "But I learned those things because they needed learning. If these men are facing danger, then it's my fight too." Nash stared at her for a long moment. "You know, when I first saw you in Boston, I thought you were just another city woman playing at adventure. I was wrong about a lot of things." "You saw me in Boston?" Eleanor's heart skipped. "Where?" Nash looked uncomfortable. "Outside your dress shop. The day before the cattle drive started. Morrison sent me to check on supplies, and I saw you through the window, working on some kind of fancy dress. You looked so focused, so skilled. I remember thinking you had no business on a cattle trail." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You were watching me, just for a moment. Long enough to see that you cared about your work the way most people care about family. Takes a special person to put that much of themselves into what they do." Something had shifted between them during this conversation, though Eleanor couldn't quite name what it was. Nash had always been careful to maintain distance, but now he seemed to be deliberately closing the gap. "Nash," she said softly. "What was your partner's name? The one Kellerman killed?" "Samuel Morrison. Sam. He was Jake's younger brother." Eleanor's breath caught. "Morrison's brother? Does Jake know you're the one who went after Kellerman?" "Jake knows." "Why do you think he hired me?" "Wasn't for my charming personality." "So, you've been riding with this outfit because Jake gave me a chance to rebuild something I thought was gone forever. And because Sam deserved better than what he got." Eleanor understood now why Nash carried himself like a man with a mission. He wasn't just a cowboy working for wages. He was carrying the weight of justice delayed and friendship betrayed. No wonder he held himself apart from the others. "How did you form new connections when you were still tending the wounds of old ones?" The attack came 3 days later, just as the sun was setting behind the jagged rocks of the Badlands. Eleanor was banking the fire for the night when she heard the first gunshot echoing off the canyon walls. Within seconds, the peaceful evening erupted into chaos. Nash's voice cut through the confusion. "Eleanor, get under the chuck wagon and stay there." But Eleanor had no intention of hiding while the men fought for their lives. She grabbed the rifle Morrison had insisted she learn to use and found a position behind the wagon where she could see the approaching riders. Kellerman's gang came fast and hard, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. They attacked from 3 directions at once, trying to scatter the cattle and isolate the defenders. Eleanor could see Nash moving through the confusion like a man possessed, his gun firing with deadly accuracy while he shouted instructions to the other cowboys. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it felt like days. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of Kellerman's men lay dead, and the rest had retreated into the rocks. But the victory came at a cost. 2 of Morrison's cowboys were wounded, and several cattle had been lost in the panic. Nash appeared at Eleanor's side as she was tending to young Tommy's bullet graze. His shirt was torn, and blood seeped from a cut on his cheek, but his eyes held a satisfaction she had never seen before. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "But not tonight. Kellerman likes to plan his next move when he's been hurt." Eleanor looked up from her bandaging. "How badly are we outnumbered?" "Bad enough. But we hurt them today, and that counts for something." Over the next week, Kellerman's gang played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the cattle drive. They attacked supply lines, scattered cattle during the night, and generally made life miserable without committing to another full assault. The constant tension wore on everyone's nerves, but it seemed to energize Nash in a way that surprised Eleanor. She began to see glimpses of the man he had been before tragedy reshaped him. His natural leadership abilities emerged as he coordinated the defense efforts. His knowledge of outlaw tactics proved invaluable in predicting Kellerman's next moves, and his easy competence with weapons reminded everyone that some men were simply born to fight for what was right. But the change that surprised Eleanor most was how Nash began to open up to her during the brief quiet moments between attacks. As if the prospect of violence had burned away his careful reservations, he started sharing pieces of his past that helped her understand the man behind the mystery. "Sam and I grew up together in Kansas," he told her one evening as they waited for his watch to begin. "His family took me in when my folks died of fever. Jake was already working cattle drives by then. But Sam wanted to be a lawman, said the frontier needed men willing to stand between honest folks and the wolves that preyed on them." "And you agreed with him?" "I believed in him. Sam had this way of making you believe that one person could actually make a difference, that justice wasn't just a pretty word people used to feel better about themselves." Eleanor could hear the pain in Nash's voice, the wound that had never properly healed. "What happened the day Kellerman killed him?" Nash stared into the fire for a long moment. "We were tracking a gang that had been hitting banks across 3 territories. Got word they were planning to rob the Abilene Bank on a Wednesday morning. Sam wanted to set up an ambush, catch them in the act. I argued for waiting for backup, but Sam said waiting meant more innocent people might get hurt. So you went in with just the 2 of you?" "Yeah, and it worked, mostly. We stopped the robbery, arrested 2 of the gang members. But Kellerman got away, and Sam went after him alone while I was securing the prisoners. By the time I followed, it was too late. Found Sam in an alley behind the bank, shot in the back. Eleanor felt her heart break a little for the young man Nash had been. Full of idealism and faith in justice. I'm sorry. The worst part wasn't losing Sam, though that nearly killed me. The worst part was what happened after. The town council decided that chasing Kellerman was too dangerous, too expensive. They wanted to call it a closed case and move on. Said one dead lawman was enough. But you didn't agree. Nash's smile held no warmth. I handed in my badge that same day and went after Kellerman on my own. Took me 6 months to track him down. And when I did, he stopped speaking, but Eleanor could fill in the blanks. What did you do? What needed doing? Left him for the law to find, though I wasn't particular about what condition he was in when they found him. Eleanor understood now why Nash had seemed so haunted, so careful about forming connections. He had learned that justice was sometimes a luxury honest people couldn't afford, and that protecting the people you cared about might require choices that left marks on your soul. So, when you saw Kellerman's name again, I knew this was my chance to finish what Sam and I started. Only this time, I wasn't wearing a badge, and I wasn't answering to anyone but myself. The admission hung between them like a bridge Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Nash wasn't just a cowboy with a mysterious past. He was a man who had deliberately chosen a path that might lead to violence and death. The question was whether she was prepared to care about someone who lived so close to the edge of darkness. The answer came to her during Kellerman's final assault. The attack happened at dawn, when the light was uncertain and the cattle were restless from another sleepless night. This time, Kellerman brought his full force, determined to overwhelm Morrison's defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. Eleanor found herself crouched behind the chuck wagon again. But this time she was actively participating in the fight, reloading rifles for the men and watching for threats they might miss. The battle was fiercer than before, with bullets flying from every direction and the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. She was passing ammunition to Morrison when she saw Nash break cover and charge toward a group of outlaws who had gotten too close to the cattle. It was an incredibly brave and incredibly foolish move that left him exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed a rifle and began firing at the outlaws, threatening Nash's position. Her shots weren't particularly accurate, but they were enough to make Kellerman's men take cover and give Nash the seconds he needed to reach safety. When the smoke finally cleared, Kellerman himself lay dead among the rocks, and his surviving gang members were in full retreat. The threat that had haunted the cattle drive was finally over, but Eleanor barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Nash, who sat leaning against a boulder with blood soaking his shirt and a pale, shaky look that frightened her more than all of Kellerman's guns. "You hit?" she asked, dropping to her knees beside him. "Just a scratch," he said, but his voice was weak. Eleanor pushed his hands away from the wound and examined it herself. The bullet had grazed his ribs, deep enough to bleed freely, but not deep enough to be immediately dangerous. She tore strips from her petticoat and began bandaging the injury with the same focused attention she once gave to delicate embroidery. "You're going to be fine," she said, as much to convince herself as him. "Eleanor." Nash caught her hand as she worked. "Thank you for the covering fire back there. Thank you for not getting yourself killed." Nash smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it reached his eyes. "You know, I've been thinking about what comes next. After we reach Colorado." Eleanor's hands stilled. "What about it?" "Morrison's offered me a permanent position running security for his ranch. Good pay, steady work, chance to put down roots somewhere. That sounds like a good opportunity." "It is. Question is whether I'd be putting those roots down alone." Eleanor looked up from the bandage to find Nash watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "What are you asking me?" "Oh, I'm asking if a former dressmaker turned trail cook might be interested in trying a new adventure. One that doesn't involve quite so much shooting." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't say whether they came from relief, joy, or the simple, overwhelming nature of everything that had happened. "I think that former dressmaker might be very interested indeed." Nash reached up and touched her cheek gently. "Good. Because I've got plans for our life together. And most of them involve you being around to see them through. As Eleanor leaned down to kiss him, tasting dust and hope and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine, she realized that some journeys took you exactly where you needed to be, even when the destination was nothing like what you had originally planned. The rim of the frontier was still days away, but she was beginning to understand that home wasn't a place you reached. It was something you built with the right person, one day at a time. Marcus moved through the station's ventilation system like water flowing downhill, finding the path of least resistance while maintaining steady progress toward his objective. The central hub lay 3 levels above his current position, but the direct route was heavily guarded. Instead, he was taking a path that would have been impossible for any of the larger alien species, threading through maintenance passages barely wide enough for his human frame. The hegemony's communication chatter had increased dramatically since his bluff with Commander Thexvar's voice. Through his helmet's passive scanning systems, Marcus could monitor their radio traffic. They were confused, trying to determine if a rescue force was actually approaching, or if they were being deceived. Good. Confused enemies made mistakes. Marcus paused at a junction in the ventilation system to check his equipment. His ammunition was holding up well, but that was because he hadn't been relying on firepower. The shaped charges were running low, and he had used most of his specialized equipment. From this point forward, he would have to rely more on improvisation and less on preparation. He pulled up the station's schematic on his helmet display and cross-referenced it with the thermal imaging data he had been collecting. The central hub was showing significant heat signatures, indicating a large concentration of people, most likely the majority of the hostages, along with a substantial guard force. But there was something else. A smaller heat signature, separated from the main group and located in what the blueprints identified as a storage room adjacent to the hub. The signature was moving in a pattern that suggested someone pacing back and forth, someone who wasn't restrained. A collaborator, perhaps, or someone in charge. Marcus made a decision. Before attempting to rescue the hostages, he needed intelligence about the hegemony's plans and capabilities. The isolated figure might provide that intelligence, willing or not. The storage room was accessible through a service corridor that connected to the station's main power distribution system. Marcus found himself crawling through a space filled with heavy electrical conduits and cooling systems, the air thick with the ozone smell of high-voltage equipment. He could hear voices now, coming from the storage room ahead. Someone speaking in the hegemony's language, their tone suggesting they were giving orders or receiving reports. Marcus positioned himself near a ventilation grate that provided a view into the room. The figure was a hegemony officer, distinguished from the regular soldiers by the complex insignia on his armor and the aura of command that seemed to surround him. He was speaking into a portable communication unit, his forearms gesturing emphatically as he talked. Marcus activated his universal translator and adjusted the sensitivity to maximum. The conversation that emerged painted a grim picture. "The peacekeeping force has been neutralized," the officer was saying. "Our perimeter sensors show no signs of incoming ships. Whatever transmission we intercepted was either a bluff or a delayed communication from the destroyed pods." A voice crackled back through the communicator, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Excellent. How is the data extraction proceeding?" 7. On schedule. We will have complete files on the terraforming technology within 3 hours. The research team was more cooperative once we began executing the non-essential personnel. Marcus felt his jaw clench. They had already started killing hostages. "Very good," the voice on the communicator continued. "Begin final preparations for extraction. I want all evidence of our presence eliminated. That includes the research station itself and any remaining witnesses." "Understood. The demolition charges are already in place. Once we have the data, we can destroy the station and make it appear that the research team suffered a catastrophic accident." The officer ended the communication and moved toward the storage room's exit. Marcus had heard enough. He needed to act. And he needed to act now. But as the hegemony officer reached for the door controls, Marcus realized he had an opportunity for something more valuable than just eliminating another enemy. The officer's portable communicator was still active, connected to what was obviously the command structure of the entire operation. An idea began to form in Marcus's mind. A crazy, desperate idea that would either save the hostages or get them all killed. Marcus waited until the officer had left the storage room, then dropped through the ventilation grate with cat-like silence. The portable communicator sat on a table where the officer had left it, its screen showing an encrypted connection to what appeared to be a ship in orbit. Marcus studied the device for several minutes, analyzing its construction and interface. The technology was advanced, far beyond anything humans had developed, but technology followed patterns, and Marcus had spent enough time working with alien equipment to recognize some of those patterns. He couldn't break the encryption, but he didn't need to. Instead, Marcus carefully opened the communicator's casing and made a series of precise modifications to its transmission system. When he was finished, the device would still function normally, but it would also do something else, something its makers had never intended. Marcus slipped back into the ventilation system just as the hegemony officer returned to the storage room. Through the grate, he watched as the alien picked up the communicator and activated it. "Command, this is Ground Team Leader. Final status report." The voice that answered was the same one Marcus had heard before, cold and authoritative. "Proceed with your report. Data extraction is at 85% completion. All hostages are secure. No signs of outside interference." "Excellent. Begin execution of the final phase." Marcus smiled grimly. The modifications he had made to the communicator were working perfectly. Every word of the conversation was being recorded and simultaneously transmitted on a frequency that would be picked up by any peacekeeping force vessel within 100 light-years. But more importantly, the signal was also being broadcast on a frequency that Marcus knew very well: the emergency band used by human military forces. If there were any human ships in the area, they would know exactly what was happening on the research station, and they would know that one of their own was in trouble. Marcus began moving toward the central hub, but he took a detour that led him through the station's primary computer core. The research station's main database was located here, protected by security systems that the hegemony had easily bypassed. But Marcus wasn't interested in the research data. He was interested in the station's operational systems. Every research station of this size had emergency protocols built into its basic operations: fire suppression systems, emergency lighting, automated distress signals, and most importantly, lockdown procedures designed to contain dangerous experiments or security breaches. Marcus found what he was looking for in the station's environmental control system. With a few careful adjustments to the programming, he could turn the research station itself into a weapon. The first change was subtle. Marcus altered the atmospheric pressure regulation to create small pressure differences between different sections of the station. Nothing dangerous, but enough to interfere with the hegemony soldiers' equipment. Their armor was designed to operate in standardized atmospheric conditions, and even minor variations would affect their movement and accuracy. The second change was more dramatic. Marcus activated the station's emergency lockdown protocols, but he modified them to work in reverse. Instead of sealing blast doors to contain a threat, the doors would open and close in a pattern designed to channel movement toward specific areas where Marcus would be waiting. The third change was the most audacious. Marcus accessed the station's artificial gravity generators and programmed them to create localized gravity fields that would shift and move throughout the station. The effect would be subtle at first, but would gradually intensify, making it increasingly difficult for the hegemony forces to maintain their positions. With the environmental systems turned to his advantage, Marcus began his final approach to the central hub. The main corridor leading to the hub was heavily defended, with guard posts at regular intervals and overlapping fields of fire that would make a direct assault suicidal. But Marcus had never planned a direct assault. Instead, he began what military tacticians called a harassment campaign. Small, quick strikes, designed not to destroy the enemy, but to demoralize and confuse them. The goal wasn't to win a battle, but to make the enemy so paranoid and exhausted that they would make mistakes. The first guard post fell to Marcus's modified gravity fields. As the artificial gravity fluctuated in the corridor outside their position, the two hegemony soldiers found themselves struggling to maintain their footing. When one of them stepped out to investigate the phenomenon, Marcus was waiting with a taser and a sleeper hold. The second guard, hearing the sounds of struggle, activated his communicator to call for backup. But the atmospheric pressure changes Marcus had programmed into the station's systems interfered with the radio transmission, turning his urgent calls into garbled static. By the time the guard realized his communications were compromised, Marcus had already moved on to the next position. The pattern continued throughout the station. Guards would find themselves dealing with malfunctioning equipment, environmental anomalies, and communication failures. Some would investigate, leaving their positions to search for the source of the problems. Others would hunker down and wait for orders that never came. Marcus picked off the isolated ones and avoided the entrenched ones, gradually reducing the hegemony force through a campaign of precision strikes and psychological warfare. But he was running out of time. The data extraction was nearing completion, and Marcus could hear increased activity from the central hub. The hegemony was preparing for their final phase, which meant the execution of hostages and the destruction of the research station. Marcus reached the final approach to the central hub just as alarms began blaring throughout the station. Not the general alarm that would indicate a station-wide emergency, but a specific tactical alert that meant the hegemony had realized they were under attack. Through the final corridor's reinforced windows, Marcus could see into the central hub. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Nearly 150 civilians were crowded into the hub's main chamber, their hands bound behind their backs and their faces showing the exhaustion and terror of people who had been pushed beyond their limits. The hostages included representatives from dozens of species, all united in their fear. Surrounding them were 20 hegemony soldiers, their weapons trained not on potential threats, but on the hostages themselves. At the center of the group stood the officer Marcus had seen in the storage room, a portable execution device in his hands. "Attention, unknown intruder." The officer's voice echoed through the station's communication system. "You have 30 seconds to surrender yourself, or we will begin executing hostages, one every 10 seconds until you present yourself." Marcus felt the familiar cold settle in his stomach. This was the moment he had been dreading, the point where all his tactical advantages meant nothing, because the enemy was willing to murder innocent people to achieve their goals. He could surrender and hope that his capture would buy the hostages time. But he knew the hegemony's reputation. They would kill him and the hostages anyway, leaving no witnesses to their crimes. He could attempt a direct assault, using the confusion of battle to try to save as many civilians as possible. But 20 armed soldiers against one human was not odds that favored survival, for him or the hostages. Or he could do something that no one would expect, something so audacious and desperate that it might just work. Marcus activated his helmet's external speakers and addressed the hegemony officer directly. "This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen of the Terran Marine Corps. I'm willing to discuss terms." The officer's laugh was cold and sharp. "Terms? You are in no position to negotiate terms, human. You will surrender immediately, or innocent people will die." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had just realized he held all the cards, "I think you'll find that I'm in an excellent position to negotiate. Because in about 30 seconds, your ship is going to have some very unexpected visitors." The officer's expression changed, uncertainty replacing arrogance. "What are you talking about? I've been broadcasting everything on the Terran emergency frequency. Your location, your intentions, and your crimes. The Human Defense Force doesn't take kindly to people who threaten civilians under their protection." It was a bluff, but it was a bluff based on truth. The signal from the modified communicator was indeed being transmitted on human military frequencies. Whether anyone was close enough to receive it was another question entirely. "You're lying," the officer said, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. "Am I?" Marcus asked. "Tell me, how long do you think it takes for human warships to reach this position once they know their people are in danger?" "I'll give you a hint. It's a lot faster than you think." The officer was silent for several seconds, clearly weighing his options. Around him, the other hegemony soldiers were looking increasingly nervous. They had signed up to raid a research station, not to fight human military forces. Marcus could see the moment when the officer made his decision. The alien's face hardened with resolve, and he raised the execution device toward the nearest hostage. "Then I suppose we'll have to work faster," the officer said. That was when the lights went out. Marcus had been counting on the officer's predictable response. The moment the hegemony leader had raised the execution device, Marcus had triggered the final phase of his environmental modifications. Every light in the central hub died simultaneously, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. But Marcus had night vision, and the hegemony soldiers did not. What followed was 30 seconds of controlled chaos as Marcus moved through the darkened hub like a force of nature. His targets weren't the soldiers but their weapons, using precision strikes and his knowledge of alien anatomy to disarm rather than kill. The hegemony forces found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see, in terrain that had become alien and hostile. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, making it impossible to maintain stable firing positions. The atmospheric pressure changes interfered with their targeting systems and made their movements clumsy and unpredictable. Most importantly, the darkness meant they couldn't distinguish between hostages and threats, effectively neutralizing their advantage in numbers. When the emergency lighting finally activated, bathing the hub in dim red illumination, the situation had changed completely. 20 hegemony soldiers lay unconscious or disarmed throughout the chamber. The hostages, while still bound, were unharmed and showing signs of hope for the first time in days. And in the center of it all stood Marcus Chen, his rifle trained on the hegemony officer, who now found himself alone and outnumbered. "Now," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had just accomplished the impossible. "I believe we were discussing terms." The hegemony officer stared at Marcus with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. Around them, the unconscious forms of his soldiers served as testament to what a single human had accomplished against overwhelming odds. The hostages watched in silence, their faces showing hope mixed with exhaustion. "Impossible," the officer whispered. "You're just one human. How did you—" "That's your first mistake," Marcus said, keeping his rifle trained on the alien while he moved toward the nearest group of hostages. "You're thinking like a soldier when you should be thinking like a human." The officer's forearms twitched, his hand moving slightly toward a concealed weapon. Marcus's rifle swung toward him with fluid precision. "I wouldn't. You've seen what I can do when I'm trying not to kill anyone. Don't make me reconsider that policy." The alien froze. "What do you want?" "Simple. You're going to order your remaining forces to stand down. Then you're going to contact your ships and call off this entire operation. The hostages go free, the research data gets returned, and everyone goes home." The officer's laugh was bitter. "You truly don't understand what you're dealing with. The hegemony doesn't negotiate with inferior species. Even if I wanted to comply with your demands, my superiors would never accept such terms." Marcus had expected this response. In his experience, military fanatics were predictably inflexible. That was why he had prepared a backup plan. "Then let me explain something about humans," Marcus said as he began cutting the restraints binding the nearest hostages. "We don't just think tactically. We think strategically. I didn't just disable your soldiers and capture you. I've been playing a much longer game." The officer's expression grew wary. "What are you talking about?" Marcus smiled grimly as he helped a Velkari scientist to her feet. The elderly researcher nodded her thanks and immediately began assisting other hostages. "Remember that communicator you've been using to report to your command ship? The one I had access to while you were planning your final phase?" The color drained from the officer's face. "What did you do?" "I did what humans do best. I improvised." Marcus moved to the next group of hostages, his rifle never wavering from its target. "That device isn't just transmitting your communications anymore. It's also broadcasting a very detailed record of this entire operation to anyone listening on human military frequencies." "Impossible. Our encryption protocols are unbreakable." "Your encryption is fine, but I wasn't trying to break it. I was trying to bypass it." Marcus cut through another set of restraints, freeing 2 Zephyrian researchers who immediately began helping their colleagues. "Every word you've spoken, every order you've given, every threat you've made against civilians has been recorded and transmitted in real time." The officer's four hands clenched into fists. Even if that's true, no human ships are close enough to respond. Your species has barely expanded beyond your home system. That's true, Marcus agreed. But you're forgetting about our allies. As if summoned by his words, a new voice crackled through the station's communication system. The voice was mechanical, translated through universal communication protocols. But the authority behind it was unmistakable. Attention hegemony forces. This is Commander Thexvar of the Galactic Peacekeeping Authority. We have received detailed intelligence about your criminal activities and are prepared to respond accordingly. The hegemony officer's face went pale. The peacekeeping force was destroyed. We monitored their approach and confirmed their elimination. You destroyed the stealth pods, Marcus corrected. But Commander Thexvar had the intelligence to keep the main force at a safe distance when his advance team failed to report in. When my transmissions reached them, they had all the information they needed to mount a proper assault. The communication system crackled again, this time with a different voice. Human, female, carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. This is Captain Sarah Mitchell of the human defense ship Indomitable. We've been monitoring the situation and are prepared to provide assistance to the peacekeeping force. Marcus couldn't suppress a grin. Captain Mitchell had a reputation throughout human space for arriving at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right amount of firepower. You see, Marcus explained to the increasingly pale hegemony officer, humans have a saying, no one fights alone. When you threaten one of us, you threaten all of us. The officer was silent for several moments, clearly calculating his rapidly diminishing options. Around the hub, the freed hostages were organizing themselves, helping the injured and checking on their colleagues. Despite their ordeal, they were showing the resilience that had allowed so many species to thrive in the galaxy. Even if what you say is true, the officer finally said, my ships still control the orbital space around this station. They can destroy both the peacekeeping force and your human vessel before they can mount an effective assault. That's your second mistake, Marcus replied. You're still thinking like someone who fights for conquest, instead of someone who fights for protection. The station shuddered suddenly, a deep vibration that seemed to come from every direction at once. The artificial gravity fluctuated for a moment before stabilizing, and the lights flickered ominously. What was that? The officer demanded. Marcus checked his chronometer. That was the first phase of my real plan taking effect. Before the officer could ask what he meant, the communication system activated again. This time the voice belonged to Commander Thexvar, but the tone was completely different from his usual formal military bearing. Attention all ships in the Kepler 442b system. This is an official notification that the research station is now under protection of Article 12 of the Galactic Accords. The hegemony officer's forearms began to shake. Article 12? That's impossible. Article 12 only applies when civilian populations are threatened by weapons of mass destruction, Marcus finished. Which brings us to your third mistake. You assumed that the demolition charges you placed throughout the station were undetectable. The truth hit the officer like a physical blow. You found them. I found them, analyzed them, and realized something very important about your plan. Marcus helped the last group of hostages to their feet, while keeping his weapon trained on his target. You weren't just planning to destroy the research station. Those charges are powerful enough to crack the planet's crust and trigger seismic activity that would devastate the entire system. The implications of Marcus's words sent a chill through the hub. The hostages, who had thought their ordeal was nearly over, realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than simple theft and kidnapping. That's not possible, the officer protested. The charges are precisely calculated to destroy only the station. Your charges may be, but you didn't account for what would happen when they interacted with the station's fusion reactors. The energy cascade would be enough to trigger a planet-wide catastrophe. Marcus's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Infallinance, which means that under Article 12, any ship that attacks this station or attempts to prevent evacuation is guilty of attempted genocide. The communication system crackled with new voices as ship after ship announced their arrival in the system. The peacekeeping force had called in reinforcements from across the sector, and the response was overwhelming. Velkari battlecruisers, Zephyrian interceptors, and sleek human destroyers all converging on the research station's location. The penalty for attempted genocide under galactic law is immediate and total destruction, Marcus continued relentlessly. No trials, no appeals, no mercy. Your ships can choose to surrender and face conventional punishment for piracy and kidnapping, or they can attack and face annihilation. The hegemony officer was silent for nearly a minute, his forearms trembling as the full scope of his situation became clear. His criminal raid had become a potential genocide, and the galaxy's response had been swift and decisive. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. How? How did one human turn our perfect operation into a disaster? Marcus lowered his rifle slightly, though he remained ready to raise it again at the first sign of trouble. You want to know the difference between humans and the rest of the galaxy? It's not that we're stronger, or smarter, or more advanced. It's that we don't think about winning battles. We think about solving problems. He gestured toward the hostages, who were now organized into groups based on their injuries and needs. Despite everything they had endured, they were working together, helping each other, showing the kind of cooperation that made civilization possible. You saw a research station full of valuable technology and defenseless civilians. So you planned a military operation to take what you wanted and eliminate the witnesses. Classic tactical thinking. Marcus began walking slowly around the hub, his rifle still trained on the officer, but his attention focused on explaining something that clearly went beyond the alien's understanding. But I saw something different. I saw a problem that needed solving. The problem wasn't how to defeat 20 armed soldiers. The problem was how to save 150 innocent lives while ensuring that this kind of attack never happens again. The station shuddered again as the peacekeeping fleet took up positions around the hegemony ships. Through the hub's windows, the lights of dozens of vessels could be seen converging on their location. So I didn't fight a battle. I created a situation where the only rational choice was surrender. I turned your own weapons against you, used your communication systems to document your crimes, and ensured that any attempt to complete your mission would result in consequences far worse than failure. The hegemony officer was staring at Marcus with something approaching awe. You planned all of this from the beginning. Not planned, adapted, Marcus corrected. That's the real difference between human thinking and military thinking. Military thinking follows predetermined strategies and tactics. Human thinking responds to circumstances and finds solutions that no one else considered possible. The communication system activated again, this time carrying the voice of the hegemony fleet commander. When he spoke, his tone carried the weight of defeat. Ground team, this is Fleet Command. We are reconsidering our operational parameters. Prepare for immediate extraction and surrender to peacekeeping forces. The officer in the hub closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them to look directly at Marcus. I need to ask you something, human, before this ends. Marcus nodded. We studied your species before this operation. According to our intelligence, humans are physically weaker than most galactic species. Your technology is primitive compared to ours. Your military has no experience fighting in space. By every logical measure, you should have been helpless against us. The officer's forearms spread wide in a gesture of complete confusion. So how did one human marine accomplish what an entire fleet couldn't? Marcus was quiet for several seconds, considering the question. Around them, the freed hostages were preparing for evacuation, their faces showing relief and gratitude. Through the windows, the lights of the rescue fleet painted the darkness with promise of safety. When Marcus finally answered, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had just proven something important about the nature of courage and determination. You're asking the wrong question. It's not about how one human defeated your fleet. It's about why I tried in the first place. Marcus gestured toward the hostages, the scientists and researchers who had dedicated their lives to making the galaxy a better place for all species. Your people fight for conquest, for resources, for dominance. That's why you think in terms of superior firepower and tactical advantage. But humans fight for something different. We fight for people who can't fight for themselves. We fight for principles that matter more than our own survival. He lowered his rifle completely, the gesture somehow making him seem larger rather than smaller. You want to know what makes humans dangerous? It's not our weapons or our tactics or our technology. It's that we don't calculate odds when innocent lives are at stake. We don't surrender when the enemy seems too strong. We don't give up when the mission seems impossible. Marcus looked directly into the officer's eyes, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. We keep fighting because that's what humans do. And when you threaten the people we've sworn to protect, you discover that impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been accomplished yet. The silence that followed Marcus's words seemed to stretch across the entire station. The hegemony officer stared at him with an expression of wonder, as if he had just witnessed something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of the universe. When Commander Thexvar's voice came through the communication system, it carried a tone of respect that Marcus had never heard before. Staff Sergeant Chen, this is Commander Thexvar. Prepare for immediate evacuation. The medical team is standing by to examine the hostages, and the engineering team will handle the demolition charges. Marcus activated his radio for the first time since entering the station. Copy that, Commander. All hostages are secure and ready for evacuation. The situation is under control. Under control? Thexvar's voice carried a note of amazement. Staff Sergeant, you single-handedly prevented a genocide and saved 150 lives while outnumbered 20 to 1. I think under control might be an understatement. Marcus looked around the hub one more time, watching as peacekeeping force medics began arriving through the airlocks to assist the hostages. The crisis was over. The innocent were safe. The criminals would face justice. Just another day in the life of a human Marine. With respect, sir, Marcus replied, this is just what humans do. We solve problems, and protecting innocent people isn't a problem, it's a privilege. As the evacuation began and the hostages were safely transferred to the rescue ships, word of what had happened began to spread throughout the galactic community. The story of one human Marine who had defeated an entire enemy force through courage, ingenuity, and moral conviction became legend. But for Marcus Chen, the real victory wasn't in the tactical accomplishments or the strategic implications. It was in the faces of 150 people who would go home to their families because one human had decided that impossible was just another challenge to overcome. And throughout the galaxy, other species began to understand that humanity's real strength wasn't in their weapons or their technology. It was in their refusal to accept that anyone should suffer when they had the power to help. That was the day the galaxy learned what humans meant when they said that no one fights alone. And it was the day Marcus Chen's answer to impossible odds left everyone speechless.